Welcome, sleepless travelers. Tonight, we discover medieval secrets.
I thought we'd talk about the year 536. Where are you in the world right now? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. What would you do if the sun simply vanished? Not forever, mind you, but for months on end. Imagine waking up each day to a perpetual twilight, a world drained of warmth and color. That, my friend, is precisely what happened in 536 AD. It wasn't a good year for tanning, let me tell you. Contemporary accounts paint a grim picture. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of a year when the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Others described a persistent haze, a dimming of the celestial fire that brought with it not only darkness, but also a chilling cold. If they had Instagram back then, the filters would have been permanently set to sepia doom. The psychological impact must have been immense. Imagine the dread, the uncertainty, the fear of the unknown. The world, usually so reliable, so predictable in its cycles of day and night, had suddenly become unreliable. Crops failed, livestock perished, and the whispers of impending doom grew louder with each passing day. It was basically a medieval horror movie, but without the popcorn. Speaking of popcorn, it would have been a poor year for growing corn. Now that we've covered the initial darkness, let's talk about the potential causes. If you've ever experienced a power outage, you know the unsettling feeling of being cut off from the familiar comforts of modern life. But medieval people were far more dependent on the sun. It was their clock, their calendar, their source of warmth, and their guide. When it disappeared, they were plunged into a darkness far deeper than any blackout could replicate. The difference was that we know the power will come back on. For them, there was no such certainty. Sure, they had candles, but that's not exactly comparable to a star going out. The whispers turned to shouts, and people tried to find answers. Natural disasters, divine wrath, or some unknown celestial event. The lack of understanding would be terrifying. Imagine watching the sun fade and having no idea why. That is an existential nightmare. It's like trying to troubleshoot your computer when all you have is a rusty hammer. Scientists now believe that the culprit was likely a massive volcanic eruption that spewed ash and dust high into the atmosphere. This volcanic winter blocked sunlight, causing temperatures to plummet and disrupting weather patterns across the globe. It was basically nature throwing a massive tantrum. But what good is knowing the cause if you can't fix it? Modern scientific analysis of ice cores and tree rings supports this theory. These natural archives provide a detailed record of past climate conditions, revealing a sharp drop in temperature and an increase in atmospheric particles around 536 AD. It's like nature's own carbon dating system, only with more ice and fewer skeletons. From initial panic to scientific explanation, it is amazing we can now understand events of the past. Key takeaway? The year 536 AD was a time of profound darkness and uncertainty, triggered by a catastrophic event that plunged the world into a temporary twilight. Now that we've established the darkness, let's discuss what happened next. The world didn't end, of course, but life was irrevocably changed. Hey, traveler, hope you enjoyed hearing about the darkness that enveloped 536 AD. Where are you joining us from tonight? What would you do if summer vanished? Not just a mild summer, but all of summer, replaced with a persistent chill and failing crops. That's exactly what happened after the sun vanished in 536. The immediate aftermath was brutal. The temperature plummeted. Imagine trying to grow food when the sun barely shines and the temperatures hover near freezing. Crops failed, livestock died, and famine spread across the land. It wasn't a good time to be a farmer, or a cow for that matter. I bet even the weeds were struggling. Picture, if you will, a medieval supermarket where the shelves are perpetually empty. It's not a pretty picture. Contemporary accounts from Europe, Asia, and the Americas all tell a similar story: widespread crop failure, famine, and disease. The Dust Veil Winter, as it's now known, had a devastating impact on populations across the globe. It was basically a real-life version of a post-apocalyptic movie, but without the cool cars. Although, some horses would have helped. Speaking of which, the plague of Justinian followed shortly after the year without a summer. Some historians suggest that the weakened state of the population, due to famine and malnutrition, made them more susceptible to the disease. So, no sun, failing crops, then plague. Talk about a bad run. If you've ever had a bad cold, you know how it can weaken your body and make you more vulnerable to other illnesses. But medieval people didn't have access to modern medicine or even basic sanitation. So a simple cold would escalate to something terrible. The difference was that they had zero recourse for treatment. If you were sick, that was a bad sign. When your options were leeches or prayer, a good immune system was your best defense. The long-term consequences of the events of 536 were far-reaching. Some historians argue that the economic and social disruption caused by the famine and plague contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of new powers in Europe. A cold, dark year shifted history. Now that we've covered the causes, let's discuss what the effects were. Modern economic recessions can be rough, but we have social safety nets, food banks, and government assistance.
But medieval people were largely on their own. If your crops failed, you starved. There were no bailouts for bad harvests. Sure, some lords might provide relief, but that was hardly reliable. When your safety net is non-existent, a single bad year can wipe you out. The social and political upheaval caused by the events of 536 may have also contributed to the rise of new religious movements and apocalyptic beliefs. When the world seems to be ending, people tend to look for answers, and often those answers are found in faith. It's like when your phone dies and you suddenly remember that you have a book. Desperation creates new opportunities. It's hard to imagine the sheer scale of the suffering and disruption caused by the events of 536. But by understanding the challenges that people faced, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. If nothing else, people did not give up. Now that we've covered it, it is time to understand the key takeaways. Key takeaway: the aftermath of 536 was one of significant hardship across the world, followed by sickness, plagues, and societal shifts. Now that we have explored what happened, what did people do? Hey traveler, welcome back. We were just discussing the aftermath of the sun vanishing back in 536. What would you do if your entire world went into survival mode? Imagine the pressure, the desperation, the constant struggle to find food and shelter. That's what it must have been like for people in 536 and the years that followed. Let us discuss. The immediate response to the crisis was, of course, a desperate search for food. People ate anything and everything they could find: roots, berries, bark, even, in some cases, cannibalism. It wasn't pretty, but when survival is at stake, desperate measures are taken. It was like a medieval version of a reality TV show, only with higher stakes. The only reward was survival. Speaking of which, the social structures of the time were put under immense strain. As resources dwindled, competition increased, and the bonds of community began to fray. The every man for himself mentality probably became more prevalent, which is ironic because working together would have served them better. If you've ever been stuck in a traffic jam, you know how quickly people can become impatient and irritable. But medieval people didn't have the luxury of air conditioning or the option of changing lanes. The difference was the ability to leave. They did not have an off-ramp of any kind. It was fight, flight, or freeze. When your only option is to wait it out, patience is a virtue. Some communities may have turned to prayer and religious rituals in an attempt to appease the gods or seek divine intervention. When science fails, faith remains. It was like trying to fix a broken car with a prayer and a wrench. But medieval people didn't have the luxury of a mechanic. They only had faith. From desperation to divine intervention, the only thing left was hope. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities may have migrated in search of more favorable conditions. This would have put strain on relations with neighbors, but what else could people do? Think of the Dust Bowl migrations of the 1930s. You can't make crops out of dust. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered a chance of survival. The long-term consequences of these events were significant. The population declined, trade routes were disrupted, and social and political instability increased. It was like a domino effect, with each crisis leading to another. Now that we have gone through this, let's end with the key takeaways. Modern disaster relief efforts are often coordinated by governments and international organizations. But medieval people relied on their own ingenuity and resilience. They didn't have FEMA to call. Sure, some lords might provide assistance, but that was largely dependent on their own resources and goodwill. When you're on your own, you learn to be resourceful. Key takeaway: the response to the crisis of 536 was a mix of desperation, resilience, and adaptation, as people struggled to survive in a world turned upside down. Now, hopefully you are sleepy enough to nod off to sleep, thinking about that dark, cold world.
The year 536 doesn't exactly ring a bell, does it? If you've ever spent a summer day under a hazy sky, unable to see the sun clearly, you've got a tiny taste of what the people of 536 experienced, though on a scale that would make even the worst smog day look like a picnic. What if that haze lasted for over a year, dimming the sun to the point where it barely cast a shadow, and crops began to fail? This period, marked by what's often called the mystery cloud, wasn't just a slightly gloomy patch of weather. It ushered in a cascade of disasters, crop failures, widespread famine, and societal upheaval across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Now that we've set the stage, let's dive into how scientists are working to unravel the enigma of what caused this year of perpetual twilight. Geologists, those detectives of the deep past, are key to piecing together this puzzle. They sift through layers of earth like archaeologists examining ancient ruins, but instead of pottery shards, they're looking for clues etched in stone, or more accurately, frozen in ice. Speaking of clues, ice cores hold a wealth of information about Earth's past climate. Imagine them as time capsules, trapping atmospheric particles from centuries, even millennia ago. These ice cores, drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, provide a detailed record of volcanic activity. Get this: the ice cores from 536 and the years immediately following show a significant spike in sulfate deposits. So volcanic eruptions are the prime suspect. What good is that knowledge without understanding which volcano? That's where the real detective work begins. Pinpointing the precise volcano or volcanoes responsible is a monumental challenge, akin to finding a single grain of sand on a vast beach. One of the challenges is that volcanic eruptions can leave different fingerprints, depending on the type of volcano and the nature of the eruption. Some volcanoes spew ash that travels vast distances, while others release more sulfur dioxide, which forms those sunlight-dimming aerosols. Moreover, ash from different volcanoes has a unique chemical signature. The search for the smoking gun has led scientists to examine potential candidates around the globe. Candidate volcanoes include those in North America, Iceland, and even the tropics. One particularly strong contender is a massive eruption in North America, possibly in Alaska. But medieval people were not able to use satellite technology to watch the event unfold. The difference was the absence of real-time data. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was a complete lack of information, scientific deductions suddenly looked brilliant. Another theory involves a series of eruptions rather than a single cataclysmic event. This double whammy scenario suggests that one eruption might have weakened the atmosphere, making it more susceptible to the effects of a second eruption shortly thereafter. If you've ever tried to start a fire with damp wood, you know how one little setback can completely ruin your efforts. But what good is volcanic eruption without the study of tree rings? Speaking of ancient records, tree rings offer another valuable source of information about past climate conditions. The width of a tree ring reflects the growing conditions during that year. Wide rings indicate favorable conditions, while narrow rings suggest stress, such as drought or cold temperatures. Tree ring data from around the world shows a period of unusually slow growth in 536 and the years that followed. This provides further evidence of a period of widespread environmental stress, corroborating the ice core data and historical accounts. Tree rings, however, cannot tell you the entire story. Key takeaway: volcanic eruptions, evidenced by ice cores and tree rings, are the leading explanation for the events of 536. Now that we've looked at volcanoes, let's talk about other proposed explanations. While volcanic eruptions are the most widely accepted theory, some researchers have explored other potential contributing factors, such as a large asteroid impact or a comet strike. Imagine the devastation of a celestial object slamming into Earth. An impact event could have injected massive amounts of dust and debris into the atmosphere, similar to a volcanic eruption. However, evidence for such an impact in 536 is lacking. Scientists have not found any impact craters or other geological evidence to support this theory. If you are expecting solid proof of a catastrophe, you will be disappointed. Speaking of solid proof, the ocean might hold clues. Another intriguing hypothesis involves changes in ocean currents. Ocean currents play a crucial role in regulating global climate. A sudden shift in these currents could have disrupted weather patterns and contributed to the extreme events of 536. Ocean currents and climate can be very complicated. But what good is ocean currents without the sun? From ocean currents to solar activity, medieval life required both. Changes in solar activity, such as a period of prolonged solar minimum, could also have played a role. A solar minimum is a period of reduced solar activity, characterized by fewer sunspots and lower energy output. Reduced solar activity could have led to cooler temperatures and altered weather patterns. Now that we've covered a variety of potential causes, let's talk about how this event impacted the world. The mystery cloud of 536 had far-reaching consequences, impacting societies across the globe. The most immediate impact was on agriculture. With the sun dimmed, crops failed, leading to widespread famine. Imagine trying to grow food in perpetual twilight. Crop failures led to food shortages and soaring prices. People struggled to find enough to eat, and malnutrition became rampant. The famine, in turn, weakened populations, making them more vulnerable to disease. The famine then was followed by disease. Speaking of disease, the Justinianic plague, one of the deadliest pandemics in history, emerged around this time. The plague, which was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread rapidly through the weakened populations, decimating communities and causing widespread death. Some historians believe that the environmental stresses of 536 and the subsequent famine may have contributed to the severity of the plague. If you've ever felt run down and more susceptible to illness, you know how environmental factors can weaken the immune system. The social and political consequences were significant. The widespread famine and plague led to social unrest and political instability. Governments struggled to cope with the crisis, and some collapsed altogether. The late antique Little Ice Age began. But medieval people did not have the political systems we do today. The difference was limited resources. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative was no government at all, small leadership looked brilliant. Key takeaway: the mystery cloud triggered a cascade of disasters, including famine, plague, and societal upheaval. From societal upheaval to long-term effects, medieval life required both. The events of 536 and the years that followed had long-lasting consequences, shaping the course of history. Some historians believe that these events contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire and the rise of new powers in Europe. If you've ever seen a forest fire, you know how it can reshape the landscape. The extreme weather events also may have contributed to migrations and population movements. People displaced by famine and disease sought refuge elsewhere, leading to shifts in population distribution and cultural exchange. So while 536 was undoubtedly a terrible year, it also marked a turning point in history. Key takeaway: the events of 536 had long-lasting consequences, shaping the course of history.
The year is 536 AD. Imagine a world plunged into twilight, the sun a mere disk in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows even at midday. If you've ever experienced a particularly smoggy day, amplify that sensation tenfold and stretch it out for over a year. This wasn't a localized event. It was global. A mysterious, persistent fog choked the world, impacting everything from crop yields to societal stability. What would you do if the sun disappeared? Crop failures became widespread. Picture parched fields, stalks withered and brown, promising nothing but empty bellies. In modern times, we might turn to international aid or advanced irrigation systems, but medieval people? Their lifeline was the immediate harvest. The difference was stark. Our safety net is global. Theirs was local.
Sure, some communities had stored reserves, but hoarding wouldn't solve the issues. When your alternative is starvation, even meager rations look like a feast. Societal structures, already fragile, began to crack under the strain. Governance, usually a slow and bureaucratic process, was now an exercise in desperation. Local lords and kings faced a challenge unlike any they'd seen. No amount of tax collecting could conjure food from barren fields. Imagine a medieval king pacing in his drafty hall, wondering how to feed his people. A modern politician would call for a task force, maybe hold a press conference. This king would likely consult his advisors, perhaps a priest, and pray for a miracle, or, failing that, blame his enemies. Famine became a grim reality. Stories of starvation spread like wildfire. People ate anything they could find: roots, bark, even dirt. Desperation breeds ingenuity and desperation. Imagine trying to survive on a diet of weeds and whatever insects you could catch. That organic grocery store would suddenly look very appealing, wouldn't it? Migration became a common sight as desperate populations sought greener pastures, quite literally. Bands of starving people wandered the countryside, competing for increasingly scarce resources. Speaking of resources, this brings us to conflict. As food dwindled, tensions rose. Neighbor turned against neighbor, village against village, kingdom against kingdom. Land became a prize worth fighting for. Imagine a group of starving villagers facing off against another, equally desperate group, over a patch of meager crops. It's like Black Friday, but instead of TVs, the prize is survival. Armies, already prone to skirmishes, now had a new incentive: food. Raiding and pillaging became even more prevalent, further destabilizing the world. The hardest hit regions paint a particularly bleak picture. Europe, already reeling from the decline of the Roman Empire, suffered immensely. Fields lay fallow, trade routes crumbled, and populations plummeted. The Byzantine Empire, clinging to its eastern territories, faced both internal and external threats as food shortages weakened its defenses. Asia, too, felt the impact, with reports of widespread famine and social upheaval in China. Even the Americas, largely isolated from Europe and Asia, experienced unusual weather patterns and potential disruptions to agricultural cycles. It was as if the entire planet was holding its breath, waiting for the sun to return. But what good is waiting without hope? Now that we've covered the immediate consequences, let's talk about the underlying causes. While the exact nature of the event remains debated, the most likely culprit is a massive volcanic eruption. Imagine a volcano, not just any volcano, but a supervolcano spewing ash and dust into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. This wasn't a gentle puff of smoke. It was a cataclysmic event that altered the course of history. The dust cloud lingered for months, even years, disrupting weather patterns and causing widespread cooling. It's like putting a giant blanket over the planet, only instead of keeping us warm, it plunged us into a mini ice age. Key takeaway? The year 536 AD
was a year of unprecedented crisis, marked by crop failures, famine, social unrest, and widespread conflict, leaving a world on the edge.
The year is 536 AD. You're alive, though perhaps wishing you weren't. Now that we've covered the sun vanishing, let's talk about what happens when darkness breeds pestilence. What would you do if your world suddenly turned colder, crops failed, and then, on top of everything, a terrifying disease began to sweep across the land? It's the kind of year that makes you appreciate modern medicine and maybe hoard some hand sanitizer just in case. Speaking of modern concerns, we often worry about pandemics, but medieval people, their pandemics had style. They weren't just worried about a fever. They were worried about divine wrath manifesting as boils. But medieval people had no idea where disease came from in the first place. Now, the climate crisis of 536 created the perfect storm for disease to flourish. A weakened population, struggling with famine and cold, is far more susceptible to illness. The difference was they didn't have scientists studying viruses under microscopes. Sure, they had theories, bad air, divine punishment, astrological alignments, but these were as effective as using a sundial to fix your smartphone. When your alternative was blaming it on the planets, blaming it on miasma suddenly looked brilliant. Picture this situation. You're living in a world without effective sanitation, where rats are as common as pigeons in a modern city. Basically, it's a buffet for disease. Get this, the plague of Justinian, which erupted in 541, was devastating. It spread like wildfire, carried by fleas on rats, and decimated populations across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Imagine the Black Death, but earlier, and arguably even less understood. This early plague was thought to have come from Egypt. The difference was they didn't have the internet to spread misinformation, just terrified whispers and the grim reality of overflowing graveyards. Sure, they didn't have social media, but word of mouth could travel surprisingly fast when the alternative was shouting from town square to town square. But what good is knowing where the plague came from without understanding its impact? The impact of such widespread illness at a time with limited scientific understanding was total societal upheaval. You know how a bad flu season can disrupt things today. Multiply that by 1,000. Imagine a world where a significant portion of the population dies, trade collapses, economies crumble, and social structures are strained to the breaking point. Hey, it's as if you've got a zombie movie, only replace the zombies with bacteria. From societal disruption to individual horror, the human experience during the plague of Justinian was one of unimaginable suffering. Ever wonder what it was like to live through such a catastrophe? People watched their loved ones die agonizing deaths, often without understanding why. The fear and despair must have been overwhelming. The difference was they didn't have access to pain medication or even a clear understanding of how to care for the sick. Sure, they had herbal remedies and prayers, but these were often woefully inadequate. So remember that next time you complain about a cold medicine. Speaking of individual horror, this brings us to perception. How did people perceive such widespread illness at a time with limited scientific understanding? They often attributed it to divine punishment, moral failings, or the malevolent influence of unseen forces. Imagine trying to make sense of something so terrifying without the benefit of modern science. Look, medieval medicine was based on balancing the four humors. Basically, if you were sick, they figured you had too much blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile. The cure? Bloodletting, purging, and other delightful treatments that probably did more harm than good. Here's the thing. The difference was medieval doctors were doing their best with the knowledge they had. Sure, they were sometimes hilariously wrong, but they were also trying to alleviate suffering in a world without antibiotics or vaccines. Key takeaway: the plague of Justinian highlights the vulnerability of societies in the face of disease, particularly when compounded by environmental crises. If you've ever felt a chill of fear during a modern health scare, imagine that feeling amplified 1,000-fold with no real understanding of what was happening or how to stop it. Speaking of modern concerns, we often worry about pandemics, but medieval people? Their pandemics had style. They weren't just worried about a fever. They were worried about divine wrath manifesting as boils.
But medieval people had no idea where disease came from in the first place. Now, the climate crisis of 536 created the perfect storm for disease to flourish. A weakened population, struggling with famine and cold, is far more susceptible to illness. The difference was, they didn't have scientists studying viruses under microscopes. Sure, they had theories: bad air, divine punishment, astrological alignments, but these were about as effective as using a sundial to fix your smartphone. When your alternative was blaming it on the planets, blaming it on miasma suddenly looked brilliant. Picture this situation. You're living in a world without effective sanitation, where rats are as common as pigeons in a modern city. Basically, it's a buffet for disease. Think of it as a really, really badly managed all-you-can-eat buffet, and the consequences are far more dire than a bad stomachache. Get this, the plague of Justinian, which erupted in 541, was devastating. It spread like wildfire, carried by fleas on rats, and decimated populations across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Imagine the Black Death, but earlier and arguably even less understood. This early plague was thought to have come from Egypt. The difference was they didn't have the internet to spread misinformation, just terrified whispers and the grim reality of overflowing graveyards. Sure, they didn't have social media, but word of mouth could travel surprisingly fast when the alternative was shouting from town square to town square.
Imagine playing telephone, but with the stakes being life or death. But what good is knowing where the plague came from without understanding its impact? The impact of such widespread illness at a time with limited scientific understanding was total societal upheaval. You know how a bad flu season can disrupt things today. Multiply that by 1,000. Imagine a world where a significant portion of the population dies. Trade collapses, economies crumble, and social structures are strained to the breaking point. Hey, it's as if you've got a zombie movie, only replace the zombies with bacteria. Society's reaction to this catastrophe was as chaotic as a toddler in a china shop. Everything broke. From societal disruption to individual horror, the human experience during the plague of Justinian was one of unimaginable suffering. Ever wonder what it was like to live through such a catastrophe? People watched their loved ones die agonizing deaths, often without understanding why. The fear and despair must have been overwhelming. The difference was, they didn't have access to pain medication or even a clear understanding of how to care for the sick. Sure, they had herbal remedies and prayers, but these were often woefully inadequate. So remember that next time you complain about a cold medicine, it could always be worse. Speaking of individual horror, this brings us to perception. How did people perceive such widespread illness at a time with limited scientific understanding? They often attributed it to divine punishment, moral failings, or the malevolent influence of unseen forces. Imagine trying to make sense of something so terrifying without the benefit of modern science. Look, medieval medicine was based on balancing the four humors. Basically, if you were sick, they figured you had too much blood, phlegm, yellow bile, or black bile. The cure? Bloodletting, purging, and other delightful treatments that probably did more harm than good. Here's the thing. The difference was, medieval doctors were doing their best with the knowledge they had. Sure, they were sometimes hilariously wrong, but they were also trying to alleviate suffering in a world without antibiotics or vaccines. Their intentions were good, even if their methods resembled something closer to medieval torture. But good intentions matter. Now that we've dug up those gruesome details, let's consider perception. People then didn't understand germs. It was all about bad air. And what's worse than an explanation which just doesn't explain the facts? The most logical one, of course. The modern world wouldn't exist without the germ theory of disease. Key takeaway: the plague of Justinian highlights the vulnerability of societies in the face of disease, particularly when compounded by environmental crises. It also reminds us to be grateful for modern medicine, and that at least our plagues don't come with a side of astrological blame.
The year 536, a time of darkness, literally. But what about the years that followed? Did the sun eventually break through, or did the shadows linger, shaping the world in ways we still feel today? Tonight, as the world sleeps, we'll trace the long, winding path of the late antique Little Ice Age, a chill that settled not just on the land, but on the very bones of civilization. Now that the crops failed, the real fun begins. The immediate impact was devastating, of course. Famine, disease, societal upheaval. But the truly fascinating part is how these initial shocks rippled outwards, influencing trade, politics, and even the stories we told ourselves about the world. Think about trade routes. They were the arteries of the ancient world, pumping lifeblood goods, ideas, people across vast distances. The volcanic winter severely disrupted these arteries. Imagine trying to navigate a ship through ice-choked waters or leading a caravan across barren, frozen landscapes. Not ideal for your Amazon Prime delivery, is it? Routes shifted. Some were abandoned altogether, and new ones emerged, altering the flow of wealth and power. Cities that thrived on trade suddenly found themselves isolated, while others, strategically located along these new routes, rose to prominence. Speaking of wealth, this brings us to societal shifts. When resources become scarce, guess what happens? People get testy. Existing social hierarchies were strained, sometimes to the breaking point. Peasant revolts became more frequent, and the old order was challenged. It was like a really bad office potluck where everyone's fighting over the last stale cookie. The elite classes, naturally, tried to maintain their grip, but the foundations of their power were crumbling. But what good is societal order without political stability? The late antique Little Ice Age coincided with a period of significant political transformation. The Roman Empire, already weakened, faced new pressures. The crisis may have exacerbated existing tensions and contributed to its eventual fragmentation. In other parts of the world, empires rose and fell, their fates intertwined with the changing climate. It's like a medieval game of Risk, only with actual starvation and political intrigue. The Byzantine Empire, for example, struggled to maintain its vast territory, facing challenges from both internal rebellions and external threats. The disruption caused by the climate event certainly played a role in these struggles. From political structures to cultural interpretations, medieval life required both. Here's the thing. People need explanations. When faced with inexplicable catastrophes, they often turn to religion or mythology. The events of 536 and the subsequent years were interpreted in various ways, often as signs of divine wrath or as harbingers of the apocalypse. Imagine a medieval preacher thundering from the pulpit, warning of the end times. He probably had a point, albeit a slightly dramatic one. These interpretations shaped people's understanding of the world and influenced their behavior. Repentance, increased religious fervor, and even scapegoating became common responses. Now, about religious interpretations, long before Twitter debates, people argued about the meaning of everything. The Little Ice Age was no exception. Some saw it as a test of faith, a trial sent by God to strengthen the faithful. Others believed it was a punishment for their sins, a sign that they had strayed from the righteous path. Still others viewed it as a harbinger of the end times, a sign that the apocalypse was near. This led to all sorts of interesting and sometimes bizarre religious practices. Flagellation became more common as people sought to atone for their sins. Apocalyptic cults gained popularity, promising salvation to those who followed their teachings. It was a chaotic and confusing time, filled with fear and uncertainty. Hey, let's consider the cultural impact. What would you do if the sun disappeared for months on end? Write a really depressing poem, probably. And that's exactly what happened. The darkness and the cold seeped into the collective consciousness, influencing art, literature, and music. Themes of death, decay, and despair became more prevalent. Artists depicted scenes of suffering and hardship. Writers explored the darker aspects of human nature. Composers created mournful melodies that reflected the mood of the times. It was like a medieval goth phase, only without the eyeliner. Speaking of art, this brings us to apocalyptic prophecies. Ever wonder where those end-of-the-world scenarios come from? Well, a good chunk of them were probably inspired by events like the late antique Little Ice Age. The real-life experience of widespread suffering and environmental catastrophe fueled the imagination, leading to the creation of vivid and terrifying visions of the future. These prophecies in turn influenced people's beliefs and actions, shaping their response to the crisis. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, in a way. The more people believed that the end was near, the more likely they were to act in ways that contributed to societal breakdown. From cultural shifts to trade route changes, let's consider the legacy of darkness. The late antique Little Ice Age wasn't just a blip on the historical radar. It had lasting consequences that shaped the course of history. It contributed to the decline of some empires, the rise of others, and the transformation of European society. It influenced religious beliefs, artistic expression, and even the way people thought about the world. It was a pivotal moment in history, a turning point that set the stage for the centuries that followed. The world after 540 was a different place than the world before 536. Key takeaway? The darkness of 536 cast a long shadow, reshaping societies and influencing beliefs for generations to come.
As the quiet of night deepens and the world outside stills, let's consider the echoes of 536, a year that continues to reverberate through time. What might it whisper to our modern ears, burdened as we are with our own anxieties about a changing climate? We often talk about unprecedented events today, but history, if nothing else, is a reminder that the unprecedented has a nasty habit of becoming precedented. 536 wasn't just a bad year. It was a global catastrophe, triggered, most likely, by volcanic eruptions spewing ash into the atmosphere, dimming the sun and chilling the earth. Picture a perpetual twilight, a summer that never truly arrives. If your Instagram feed suddenly turned monochrome and the temperature plummeted unexpectedly, that might give you a taste of what it felt like. Now we have sophisticated climate models and global communication networks to understand and respond to such crises. But medieval people? Well, they had faith and very little else. The difference was in the understanding. We know the why, or at least we can make educated guesses. They just saw divine displeasure. Sure, modern responses aren't always perfect, political gridlock being what it is, but when your alternative is blaming the wrath of God for crop failure, suddenly scientific inquiry looks brilliant. Key takeaway: 536 underscores humanity's vulnerability to sudden environmental shifts, something all too relevant today. Speaking of echoes, The societal consequences of 536 are just as chilling. Crop failures led to famine. Famine led to disease, and disease, as always, led to social upheaval. The Byzantine Empire, already stretched thin, faced revolts and instability. The seeds of future conflicts were sown in the barren fields of that dark year. It's a grim reminder that environmental crises don't just stay in the realm of science. They ripple through every aspect of human life. Imagine trying to negotiate a trade deal when everyone's starving. Good luck with that. Today, we see similar patterns emerging, albeit on a different scale. Climate change is already exacerbating existing inequalities, displacing populations, and fueling conflicts over scarce resources. But medieval people weren't debating carbon taxes. They were just trying to survive. The difference was the scope of the problem. A localized famine was terrible. A global climate catastrophe is, well, you get the picture. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative is mass migration and societal collapse, international agreements start to look pretty good. Key takeaway: environmental disasters inevitably become social and political disasters, a lesson we seem doomed to relearn. But what good is dwelling on doom and gloom? The story of 536, bleak as it is, also reveals the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. People adapted, they innovated, they persevered. They developed new farming techniques, found alternative food sources, and rebuilt their communities. It's a testament to our capacity for endurance, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of DIY survival skills, but with significantly less YouTube tutorials. Today, that same spirit of resilience is needed more than ever. We face daunting challenges, but we also possess unprecedented knowledge, technology, and resources. The question is whether we can harness them effectively, and whether we can learn from the mistakes and the triumphs of the past. If your survival depended on figuring out how to grow turnips in near darkness, you'd probably get pretty creative. Key takeaway: even in the darkest times, humanity has the capacity to adapt, innovate, and endure. From the ashes of 536, a crucial message emerges: the importance of global cooperation. The crisis affected vast swaths of the world, and no single community could have solved it alone. Today, the challenges we face are even more interconnected, demanding a collective response that transcends national borders. Back then, international cooperation meant not raiding your neighbor's grain stores. The difference was the level of interdependence. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but when your alternative is global chaos, international cooperation is essential. Key takeaway: global challenges require global solutions, and the events of 536 underscore the importance of working together. As we conclude this exploration of a year that time almost forgot, let's not just focus on the despair. Let's remember the flicker of hope that persisted, the unwavering human spirit that refused to be extinguished, because that spirit, that echo of resilience, is what will ultimately guide us through whatever challenges lie ahead. If history teaches us anything, it's that even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope is not lost. You know how stories often end with, "and they lived happily ever after"? Well, sometimes just surviving is the happy ending. Now, as the first light of dawn begins to paint the sky, perhaps a sense of quiet contemplation lingers. Thank you for sharing these late-night hours, delving into history's shadowed corners together. May this exploration offer not just knowledge, but a gentle reassurance that even amidst uncertainty, the human spirit, like a persistent ember, continues to burn brightly.